and welcome for all of you who are watching. You're tuned into TMH, and this is our daily English news. Our headlines for today: WFP has announced that the aid entering Ethiopia's Tigray region is not matching the needs on the ground. Witnesses told AP that kidnapping and violence and looting has also continued in Ethiopia's Tigray region, despite this ongoing truce and permanent ceasefire deal. Prominent Tanzanian politician says Abiy Ahmed needs to walk the talk regarding the Pretoria Agreement. WFP says aid entering into the Ethiopia's Tigray region is not matching the needs on the ground. The WFP, also known as the World Food Program, on Friday said aid deliveries into Tigray were not matching the needs of the stricken region, even as a ceasefire takes hold in the war-torn northern region. Restoring aid deliveries to Tigray was a key part of the agreement signed on the 2nd of November to end the ongoing 2-year war that has killed hundreds and thousands of people and unleashed a humanitarian catastrophe. The WFP said all forward road corridors into Tigray had reopened since the ceasefire, and humanitarian flights were flying into major cities, allowing a significant uptick in aid supplies reaching the region. However, the deliveries of these assistance with Tigray are not matching the needs, and the WFP and its cooperation partners urgently need access to all of the parts of the region, as the UN Food Agency said in a statement. Aid into the region and the ground to halt in late August when fighting resumed between the Ethiopian government and their allies, as well as Tigrayan forces. Even before the suspension of aid, the UN had warned many in Tigray already face starvation, with some 90% of its 6 million people dependent on food assistance. The region was isolated from the world for over a year and faced severe shortages of medicines and completely no access to electricity, banking, as well as communications. Witnesses say kidnapping, violence, and looting has continued in Ethiopia's Tigray region despite the truce. Eritrean forces' continued presence and atrocities several areas of Tigray region is said to be hurting this peace process movement. Timnis Bayru has more on these details.
According to eyewitnesses and aid workers, allies of Ethiopia's military are looting property and carrying out mass detentions in Tigray despite a truce between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray leadership. The accounts raise fresh concern about alleged atrocities more than 3 weeks after the warring parties signed a ceasefire deal that diplomats and others hoped would end the suffering in the embattled region, which is home to more than 6 million people. Troops from Eritrea, which shares a border with Tigray, and forces from the neighboring Ethiopian region of Amhara have been fighting on the side of Ethiopia's military in the Tigray conflict. They have looted businesses, private properties, vehicles, and health clinics in Shira, a northwestern town that they are occupying since last month. 2 aid workers there told the Associated Press, speaking on condition of anonymity because of safety concerns. Several young people have been kidnapped by Eritrean troops in Shira, the aid workers said. One said he saw more than 300 youths being rounded up by Ethiopian troops in several waves of mass detentions in Shira, home to a large number of internally displaced people. There are different detention centers around the town, said the aid worker, who also noted that Ethiopian troops were arresting people believed to be associated with the Tigray's People Liberation Front, the ruling party in Tigray. Civilians accused of aiding Tigray forces are being detained in the southern town of Alamata, according to a resident there, who said Amhara forces had arrested several of his friends. A former regional official said Amhara forces are also carrying out mass arrests in the town of Koram, 12 miles north of Alamata, and in surrounding rural areas. Both the Alamata resident and the former regional official, like some others who spoke to AP, requested anonymity because of safety concerns, as well as fear of reprisals. The continuing presence of Eritrean troops in Tigray remains a sore point in the ongoing peace process, and the U.S. has called for the withdrawal from the region. The military spokesman and government communications minister in Ethiopia didn't respond to a request for comment. Eritrea's embassy in Ethiopia also didn't respond. Eritrea was not mentioned in the text of the ceasefire deal. The absence of Eritrea from the ceasefire negotiations had raised questions about whether the country's repressive government, which has long considered Tigray authorities a threat, would respect the agreement. A subsequent implementation accord signed by military commanders in Kenya states that the Tigray forces will disband their heavy weapons concurrently with the withdrawal of foreign and non-federal forces from the region. Yet, aid officials, diplomats, and others inside Tigray say Eritrean forces are still active in several areas of Tigray, hurting the peace process. forces. Eritrean troops have been blamed for some of the conflict's worst abuses, including gang rapes. Tigrai Television, a regional broadcaster based in the Tigrayan capital of Mekelle, reported November 19th that Eritrean soldiers had killed 63 civilians, including 10 children, in an area called Egala in central Tigray. That report cited witnesses, including one who said affected communities were being prevented from burying their dead. 4 youths were killed by Eritrean forces in northwestern Tigray town of Aksum on November 17th, a humanitarian worker told the AP. The killings have not stopped despite the peace deal, and it is being carried out in Aksum exclusively by Eritrean forces, the humanitarian aid worker said. A statement from Tigray's communication bureau last week said Eritrea's military continues committing horrific atrocities in Tigray. That statement alleged that Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki is bringing more units into Tigray despite the ceasefire deal. Tigray is still largely cut off from the rest of Ethiopia and has limited or no access to the region for human rights researchers, making it difficult for journalists and others to obtain information as Ethiopian forces continue to enforce a siege on the region.
Thank you, Timnis Bairu. Member of Tigray Central Command, Getachew Reda, also says Eritrean forces are still on a rampage, killing children, women, as well as looting and destroying property. He disclosed that in Mai Abai last week, they summarily executed hundreds of women and children, adding that it is obvious that the Eritrean leadership has no appetite for any peaceful agreement or arrangement between the central government and Tigray, as it would stand in the way of their nefarious plans of the takeover of the Horn. Getachew said Tigray forces are doing everything in their honor to part of their Pretoria-Nairobi deal, including the disengagement of forces, but also expressed his hope and expectation that the partners of this peace deal in Addis will do their part of the deal to protect civilians and do whatever it takes to convince the external and the non-ENDF forces to in fact leave Tigray. He urged the international community on its part that should continue to put the pressure to that effect. UN Secretary General holds talks with Ethiopian Prime Minister in Addis Ababa. United States and United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is due to arrive in Addis Ababa today for a visit for several days. In the Ethiopian capital, he'll meet with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali following the signing of this peace agreement by the Ethiopian government on the 2nd of November. Meanwhile, Ethiopia's Minister of Health says $1.4 billion needs to be helping build and rebuild the health facilities destroyed by the ongoing war in the Tigray region. Minister of Health Lia Tadessa told state media that health facilities have been deliberately targeted and have been destructive during the war. The minister highlighted that according to the provisional data collected from NGOs, at least $1.4 billion is needed to rebuild health facilities that have been damaged due to conflicts across the entirety of Ethiopia. She also noted that a total of 3,600 health facilities have been in fact destroyed, most of which are in Tigray. Health facilities in many areas such as Maihuli and Debre Abai in northwestern Tigray have also been deliberately vandalized and looted to render the dysfunction. Member of Tigray Central Command Getachew Reda says security threats stuck up against Tigray should be resolved for the planned disarmament to happen. Getachew Reda told the BBC's Hard Talk that government of Tigray is ready to address the political problems in a peaceful and political manner. Let's take a listen.
Rest assured, what we are going to sell is not a carte blanche disarmament where we'll find ourselves as a lame duck against enemies. What we are trying to do with the federal government, and we hope and expect the federal government to reciprocate, is to make sure that whatever security threats stack up against Tigray are fully addressed. For example, the security considerations should take into account the forces arrayed against us, the Eritrean forces, other forces which are not part of ENDF. And of course, there are a number of issues that need to be addressed. We're not saying we are going to lay our arms down simply because there is an agreement. What we are saying is we'll lay our arms down as long as those issues are resolved. And we expect them to be resolved and soon.
Washington Examiner says U.S.-African summit should not include Africa's worst offenders. Michael Rubin, a contributor to the Washington Examiner Beltway Confidential, in an article titled "The Strategic Confusion of Biden's African Leaders Summit," decried U.S. invitation of what he called a rogue leaders like Abiy Ahmed to Washington to attend Biden's upcoming U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. 2 years ago now, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has launched a genocidal war against his country's ethnic Tigray people, killing upwards of 500,000 people. Abiy Ahmed remains unapologetic, and the former cyber intelligence officer still prefers to spend millions of dollars on a troll army to incite anti-American hatred than feed his besieged people. When President Joe Biden sent envoys to engage Abiy at the height of the Tigray war, the Ethiopian Prime Minister gleefully used his rejection of them as a means to humiliate the United States before his militant constituencies. Nevertheless, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has offered Abiy an invitation to Washington to attend Biden's U.S. African Leaders Summit. Indeed, rather than promote democracy, Biden appears to be assembling a gallery of rogues, Washington Examiner wrote. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who seeks to rule for life, is on the invite list. So too is South Sudanese President Salva Kiir, under whose rule South Sudan has fallen to the bottom of Freedom House's global freedom rankings, scoring worse than even North Korea as well as Eritrea. Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari, complicit in religious violence against southeastern Nigerians' Igbo people, is also on this invite list. According to the Washington Examiner, while a sustained and serious U.S. focus on Africa is long overdue, Biden, Sullivan, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken show condescending racism by failing to hold African leaders to the same standards they would expect of European, Middle Eastern, or even Latin American leaders. Abiy's crimes, for example, match, if not surpass, Russian President Vladimir Putin's, and yet the White House would not host Putin. China and Russia often extend their influence in Africa at the expense of human rights and good governance. Perhaps Biden believes his summit meets the great power challenge, but he undercuts the American brand and ability to compete if he signals to Africans that the U.S. will cozy up to Africa's worst abusers in the same way that Russia and China do as well. Washington Examiner argued that Biden may like to repeat the mantra that diplomacy is back, but sometimes ill-considered diplomacy can do more harm than good. White House has disclosed that President Biden invited President Sahle-Work Zewde and not Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali, which is a source that told Today News Africa that the Biden administration policy was to extend invitation to countries' heads of state, that in some cases, the heads of state passed their invitation to those others who could represent them instead. While in most African nations, the head of the state is the leader of the country, in Ethiopia, the prime minister is the head of the government and the person with the real power who takes decisions and can send the country to war. Today, News Africa first reported that Prime Minister of Ethiopia was invited by President Biden, but following conflicting information on Sunday evening, a White House National Security Council and spokesperson clarified that the leader, who was in fact invited from Ethiopia, is President Sahle-Work Zewde and not Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali. Leader of Tanzania's ACT Wazalendo Party says Abiy Ahmed needs to walk the talk regarding this Pretoria agreement. In a statement, the party leader Zito Kabwe offered an issued statement. The Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, should come out in public and clearly call all of the non-ENDF forces to pull out of Tigray as the agreement prescribes. Zito Kabwe dubbed President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea as a spoiler to the peace in Ethiopia, adding that he must be stopped immediately, also saying that Amhara political elites must be told to abandon their territorial expansionist demands and obey constitutional procedure to address the boundary complaints. Kabwe called on the African Union to immediately deploy the monitoring team as prescribed by the peace agreement to document who in fact is responsible for the continued atrocities and the conflicts in the northern region of Ethiopia. He stressed that the severely understaffed and inadequate monitoring mechanism must be expanded in order to hold all spoilers of this peace to account. Kabwe urged the US, the UK, and the EU, who hold the necessary satellite evidence, to make public their knowledge about the continuous Eritrean involvement in Tigray and to put sanctions on Eritrea if they do not immediately withdraw their forces. He noted that Tigray's regional authorities have so far implemented their sides of the deal, and it resets upon Abiy Ahmed to immediately lift the siege, restore basic services to Tigray, and finally allow unfettered humanitarian access to the starving population, as Kabwe underlined, If the Nobel laureate really believes in peace, he needs to walk the talk too, he said. Zito Kabwe disclosed that he will be visiting Tigray in the next few weeks to show his solidarity with Tigrayans on their quest for their ongoing survival. In an interview with UMD, Zito Kabwe had this to say regarding the unprecedented nature of crimes that have been committed against the people of Tigray. Let's take a listen.
What is going on in Tigray region today can easily be compared to what happened in Rwanda in 1994. And in Rwanda, it was a genocide against the minority Tutsis. There was a civil war, and it was the war within. In Ethiopia, yes, there is ethnic profiling against the Tigray people, but we had a very unique situation whereby the head of a government of a country invited another country, the army.
Thank you so much. That concludes our news for today. We'll be back with some more tomorrow. Bye-bye.